The courtroom had not been built for silence. It had been built for argument, for the percussion of gavels and the sharp volleys of legal language bouncing between marble and mahogany. But on the morning Carol Chad was called to the witness stand, every sound in that room simply stopped. Not gradually, all at once. The way sound stops in a forest when a predator moves. She was 8 years old. She wore a gray cardigan with the sleeves rolled twice at the cuff. Her shoes were the kind that had been resoled once and would need it again soon. She walked the length of the aisle without looking at the gallery, without looking at the cameras, without acknowledging the 100 pairs of eyes that tracked her the way you track something fragile moving near an edge. The only place her eyes went was forward, to the defendant's table, to the man in the pressed gray suit and the iron shackles, to Jang Jiwoo. The prosecutor, Delia Forsyth, had built her entire case on circumstantial architecture, forensic fibers matching Jang's signature look, a stolen heirloom, a rare jade cufflink from Jang's private collection, recovered near the scene. 3 witnesses who placed a man matching his description in the McFred estate's outer grounds on the night of the massacre. Her closing argument was already drafted. It was excellent. She knew it was excellent. She had read it 4 times that morning. She was no longer thinking about it. She was watching the girl. Judge Raymond Ola had 22 years on the bench. He had presided over hearings that made careers, ended legacies, and twice made international news. He adjusted his collar perhaps once per decade. He adjusted it now. Carol reached the stand. She climbed the single step and settled into the chair, a chair sized for adults, which made her look very small and somehow, because of that, very permanent. The court clerk leaned in and asked in a practiced, gentle voice whether she understood the obligation to tell the truth. Carol looked at the clerk, said nothing. The clerk glanced at Judge Ola. He gave a single nod. Proceed anyway. Because what the file said, and what everyone in this building already knew, was that Carol Chad had not spoken a single voluntary word in public since the night of October 14th. Not in the hospital. Not in the temporary housing. Not in the 3 sessions per week with the trauma specialist whose notes now occupied a sealed folder on the prosecution's table. Selective mutism triggered by acute trauma. That was the clinical language. The defense attorney, Gerard Ashby, preferred a different framing. He had used the word unreliable in 2 pretrial motions and was preparing to use it again. Ashby was assembling his notes with the practiced ease of a man who already knew the outcome when Carol's left hand moved. It was not dramatic. It was not performed. 3 fingers folded inward toward the palm. The thumb pressed flat. A small downward wave, controlled, deliberate, the motion of someone delivering a message they have been holding for a very long time. It lasted less than 2 seconds. It was the signal Arthur Chad had pressed into his daughter's hand in the dark of the pantry corridor on the last night of his life. Both palms wrapped around her small fingers. His voice dropped to almost nothing. This means hide. This means don't breathe. This means don't come out no matter what sounds you hear. He had made her practice it. 3 times, right there in the dark, while the rain hit the estate windows and something terrible moved through the rooms above them. He had needed her to know it perfectly. He had known he would not be coming back to explain it again. Across the courtroom, Jang Jiwoo stopped moving entirely. His attorney was mid-sentence. Jang was no longer present in that conversation. His eyes had locked onto Carol's hand with the precision of a man who has spent his entire adult life reading rooms, reading people, reading the coded shorthand of a world that does not write things down. He had seen that signal before. Not from a child, from Arthur himself, 6 years prior, during a waterfront negotiation where Arthur had been serving as a neutral translator between Jang's organization and a rival faction. Arthur had used the exact same gesture to warn Jang's men that plainclothes officers were moving through the crowd. It was a signal Jang had devised within his own network. It had never circulated outside of it. Arthur had been trusted with it because Arthur had been the rarest kind of man, the kind who understood that information held quietly was worth more than information spoken loudly. That man was dead. His daughter was sitting 10 meters away, performing his private language with flawless accuracy, staring at Jang across a federal courtroom like she was sliding a map under a locked door. Jang leaned back in his chair. His chains shifted once and went still. His face gave nothing. But behind it, something massive recalibrated. Because if Carol had that signal, she had been there. She had witnessed everything. And she had survived the night, survived the year, survived the silence, and walked herself into this building and aimed that signal directly at him like a compass needle finding north. He was not guilty. He had known that. What he had not known, until this moment, was that the truth had a witness, and that the witness was 8 years old and had his dead contact's muscle memory living in her left hand. 4 rows behind the prosecution table, Ronald McFred sat with his fingers laced together and his expression arranged into the appropriate civic concern of a grieving estate owner attending a trial he had personally engineered. His suit was charcoal. His cufflinks were platinum, a different pair from the ones in the evidence locker. He had been calm all morning. He was still calm. He had not seen the signal. He had not been looking at the girl's hands. He had been looking at the jury. This is worth pausing on, because what McFred did in that courtroom is not unique to fiction. It is one of the oldest and most documented patterns in criminal psychology. The perpetrator who attends the proceedings of the crime they committed, not out of arrogance, but out of a compulsive need to control the narrative in real time. Researchers call it duping delight, the neurological reward some individuals experience when they believe they are successfully deceiving the people around them. Studies of high-functioning, non-impulsive offenders show that this behavior is not reckless. It is strategic. They attend because absence creates suspicion. They present grief because grief is the expected costume. They watch the jury because the jury is the mechanism, and mechanisms can be influenced. What they almost never account for is the variable they have already dismissed. The witness they believe is either gone or broken beyond usefulness. McFred had made that calculation about Carol 11 months ago. He had been wrong by exactly the width of a cardigan pocket. Judge Ola's gavel came down. The sound of it split the room like a fault line opening. "This court will adjourn for 30 minutes. It was not a question. It was not routine. His clerk, who had served beside him for 9 years and could read his cadence the way a musician reads a score, recognized immediately that this recess had nothing to do with procedure. Delia Forsyth looked up from her table with a question forming on her face. Ashby stopped arranging his notes. In the gallery, 3 journalists reached for their phones before the echo had finished moving through the rafters. Carol sat perfectly still on the witness stand as the room began to empty around her. She did not watch the people leaving. She watched Jang being guided by 2 marshals toward the side corridor. Just before he turned the corner, he glanced back at her. It was brief. His expression didn't shift, but he dipped his chin once, almost imperceptibly, in the direction of her cardigan pocket, as if he already knew, as if he was saying, "Whatever you're carrying, hold on to it." She pressed her hand flat against the front of the cardigan, against the small, cold weight of the engraved cufflink inside it. RM the dark stain along one edge, the only physical object in this city that connected Ronald McFred's hands to the blood on the floors of his own estate. She was not going to drop it. She had carried it for 11 months. She could carry it a little longer. In the corridor outside, the court-appointed guardian, Vera, crouched in front of Carol and offered water in a paper cup. Carol took it, drank half, set it on the bench beside her with both hands, carefully, the way her father had taught her to set down anything breakable. Vera watched her with that specific, helpless tenderness of an adult who wants to offer comfort to a child who is no longer in the business of receiving it. "You did well in there," Vera said quietly. Carol looked at her, said nothing, because what she had done in that courtroom was not yet finished. It was barely started. And the man who had killed her father was still 4 rows behind the prosecution table, watching the jury, utterly certain the loose ends were tied. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was wearing the face of the man he had framed, and he had been wearing it so long he had started to believe it fit. Inside the holding room, Jang sat across from his attorney and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, quietly and without inflection, "Get a message to Darrow. Tell him the butler had a daughter. Tell him she needs a perimeter, not a tail, a perimeter. And tell him it was Arthur's signal." His attorney stared at him. Jang did not explain further. He didn't need to. Darrow would understand. Darrow had been at the waterfront that night. Darrow remembered Arthur Chad. And Darrow, whatever else he was, did not leave debts unpaid. The truth was already in motion. It was just moving through the only channels still open. a shackled man's quiet instructions and an 8-year-old girl's silence, and the cold weight of a stolen cufflink that the most powerful man in the city had no idea still existed. Back in the courtroom, Judge Ola sat alone at the bench with the case file open in front of him. He had turned to the page that read, "No surviving witnesses to the McFred estate incident." He looked at that line for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and drew a single, clean line through the word surviving. He did not write anything to replace it. He didn't need to. He had just watched the replacement walk into his courtroom in an oversized cardigan and deliver, without a single spoken word, the most articulate testimony he had seen in 22 years on the bench. He closed the file. The 30 minutes were almost up. The trial was about to resume. And somewhere in this building, Ronald McFred was still calm, still composed, still certain, still watching the mechanism he had built and oiled and set in motion. He had 30 minutes left of that certainty. He just didn't know it yet. The smell reached her first. That is the thing no one tells you about violence, that it arrives through the nose before it arrives through the eyes. The body knows. It registers threat in the oldest, most animal part of itself, the part that predates language and reasoning and the civilized architecture of thought. Carol was in the servants' pantry sorting the Tuesday linen inventory the way Arthur had shown her, folded thirds, stacked by weight, the heavier sets on the lower shelves, when the smell came under the door. Not blood. Not yet. Something before that. Gunpowder and expensive cologne and the particular metallic sharpness that fills a room when controlled people stop being controlled. She recognized none of it by name. Her body recognized all of it by instinct. She set the folded sheet down on the shelf, very quietly, the way you set something down when you suddenly understand that the sound of it matters. It had been an ordinary Tuesday until approximately 9 in the evening. The McFred estate operated on a schedule so precise you could calibrate a watch against it. The kitchen staff dismissed at 8:30, the groundskeepers out by 9, the security rotation changing at the top of the hour. Arthur Chad knew the schedule better than anyone. He had served at the estate for 6 years, and in that time had become, in McFred's estimation, indispensable, which is a specific kind of dangerous thing to become in the service of a man like Ronald McFred. Indispensable people know too much. They have access. They notice inconsistencies. They remember dates. Arthur had noticed something 3 weeks prior. He had not told Carol what it was. He had simply begun, quietly and without explanation, teaching her the signal. The rain had started around 8. By 9 it was hitting the east-facing windows with the particular persistence of a storm that intends to stay, the kind that swallows sound, that muffles footsteps, that provides excellent acoustic cover for anyone who has planned around it. Carol was still in the pantry when she heard the first door open, not the service entrance that had a specific click she knew by heart. This was the formal corridor door, the one that connected the estate's central hall to the private wing, the one that was never opened after 8 in the evening because McFred kept that wing locked whenever staff were present. It was open now. She heard voices, low, unfamiliar, the compressed cadence of men receiving final instructions rather than having a conversation. She heard her father's voice, brief, professional, the particular neutral tone Arthur used when he was managing something he had not anticipated. Then a sound she could not immediately identify, sharp and dense, not loud the way she had always imagined such sounds to be, almost polite in its brevity. Then another. Then silence that was qualitatively different from the silence before it. Heavier, conclusive, the silence of something that had been stopped rather than paused. Then footsteps, unhurried, moving toward the pantry corridor. The door opened with 4 seconds of warning. Arthur filled the frame, tall, his white butler's jacket still buttoned, his face arranged into a stillness that she would only understand much later was the stillness of a man spending every reserve he had left on not frightening his daughter. He crossed the pantry in 3 steps, crouched to her level. Took both her hands in both of his, and she felt the tremor in his fingers that his face refused to show, and that tremor told her everything his words were not going to. He pressed her palms together, folded 3 fingers inward, pressed the thumb flat, moved her hand in the small downward wave, made her do it back to him. Once, twice, 3 times. His eyes on hers the entire time, patient and absolute and terribly sad in a way she had never seen in them before. This means hide. This means don't breathe. This means don't come out no matter what sounds you hear. He straightened up, pointed to the lower cabinet behind the heavy shelving unit, the one she had always been told contained cleaning supplies, but actually contained a narrow crawl space that connected to the estate's original dumbwaiter shaft. She had not known he knew about it. She understood now that he had known for some time. She did not speak. He did not speak. He put his hand briefly on the top of her head, a pressure she would spend the next 11 months reconstructing in her memory with obsessive precision, trying to hold its exact weight, and then he turned back toward the door. She watched his shoulders, straight, deliberate, the walk of a man who has made a decision and is honoring it. He pulled the pantry door closed behind him without looking back. She heard his footsteps move down the corridor toward the formal hall, toward the voices, toward the sound she still could not name. She climbed into the cabinet. She pulled it shut. She performed the signal against her own knee in the dark, 3 fingers, thumb flat, downward wave, over and over, the way you grip something to keep from falling. Now, this is the part that stays. Through the gap where the cabinet door didn't quite meet its frame, through the sliver of yellow corridor light that remained, she saw the shadow first. It moved across the far wall of the pantry with the unhurried geometry of a man who is not afraid of being seen. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what she would later describe to the trauma specialist as a dark suit with something bright at the wrists, cufflinks that caught the corridor light and threw it back as 2 small, cold points of reflection. He paused at the pantry entrance. She held the signal pressed against her knee and did not breathe. He did not enter. He stood for perhaps 4 seconds, long enough that she memorized the silhouette, the posture, the particular way he held his hands clasped behind his back, the way powerful men stand when they are surveying something they consider already theirs. Then he moved on. She heard from somewhere in the estate's central corridor her father's voice once more. A single sentence. She could not make out the words, then nothing. The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of a house that had been emptied. There is a distinction. She felt it through the cabinet wall, through the floor, through the wooden shelf pressing against her shoulder. The estate was still physically full. Furniture, art, the 100 accumulated objects of generational wealth. But the living presence had been removed from it, the way you remove a flame from a room. And what remained was the specific, objectless cold of a space from which warmth has been permanently taken. She stayed in the cabinet for 4 hours and 17 minutes. She knew this because she counted. Arthur had taught her to count when she was frightened, not down from 10, which ends and leaves you with nothing, but up, continuously, which gives the mind an occupation and the impression of forward motion. She counted to somewhere past 9,000 before she heard the rain begin to slow. She counted past 11,000 before she pushed the cabinet door open and let the corridor light back in. She did not go to the central hall. She already knew what she would find there, and she was not ready to find it. Instead, she went the other direction, toward the estate's service exit, which connected to the staff quarters and from there to the outer grounds. She moved through the kitchen. She moved through the boot room. She was almost to the door when she stepped on something small and hard that skittered across the tile and came to rest against the baseboard. She picked it up without thinking, reflex, the automatic tidiness Arthur had instilled in her from infancy. She looked at it in her palm. A cufflink, engraved initials. The kind of object that belonged to a very specific kind of man and had no business on a boot room floor. She closed her fist around it, pushed through the service door, walked into the rain. She walked for 2 hours before anyone found her. Here is what psychology tells us about children who witness extreme violence and survive alone. The brain does not process the event as a continuous narrative. It fractures it, stores the pieces in different locations, sensory memory here, emotional response there, factual sequence somewhere else entirely, as a protective measure against the full weight of integration. This is why trauma survivors often remember the smell or the texture of a moment with crystalline precision, while the timeline around it remains fragmentary. It is not unreliability. It is architecture. The mind builds a structure around unbearable information to keep the unbearable information from collapsing everything else. What looks like inconsistency in a child witness is frequently the most honest kind of testimony available, the body reporting exactly what it retained, in exactly the form it retained it, without the editorial interference of a narrative that has been rehearsed into coherence. Carol Chad remembered the tremor in her father's hands. She remembered 2 points of reflected light at a man's wrists. She remembered the weight of a cufflink in her palm. She remembered counting. Courts have historically undervalued this kind of witness. History has repeatedly demonstrated the cost of that undervaluation. 11 months later, in a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and old argument, and the faint, drifting thread of cigar smoke from the man 4 rows behind the prosecution table, McFred's specific brand, the one he smoked exclusively, the one that followed him into every room he occupied, the smell reached Carol before anything else did. The same order as before. Nose first. Body second. Memory arriving not as recollection, but as physical fact, immediate and total, the cabinet wall against her shoulder, the corridor light through the gap, the silhouette in the doorway with the bright points at the wrists. She was back in that pantry for 3 full seconds before the gavel brought her out. The sharp crack of it against the bench, Judge Ola calling the recess, pulled her through the smoke and back into the present the way a bell pulls a diver up from depth. She was on the witness stand. The room was in motion around her. But her hand was already pressed against the front of her cardigan, over the pocket, over the cufflink, and she was breathing in measured counts the way her father had taught her, not down from 10, which ends and leaves you with nothing, but up, because up keeps moving, because up does not stop. She had the engraved initials. She had the stain along one edge. She had 11 months of silence and the specific silhouette of a man who thought no one had seen him and had been wrong about that by exactly 1 child in exactly 1 cabinet in 1 boot room on 1 rainy Tuesday in October. She was 8 years old. She was the only person alive who could end this. She was not ready. She was going to do it anyway. Because somewhere outside this building, the man with the charcoal suit and the platinum cufflinks was still operating on the assumption that loose ends, once cut, stayed cut. He had never met Arthur Chad's daughter. The holding cell smelled like industrial bleach and old concrete, and the specific staleness of recycled air that has been breathed by too many frightened people over too many years. Jang Jiwoo had been in worse places. He had, in fact, designed worse places, rooms in the lower districts where men who owed debts were invited to reconsider their accounting. He was not frightened of the cell. He was thinking. He had been thinking for 14 hours. The cot was bolted to the wall at a height that suggested it had been designed by someone who had never needed to sleep on one. Jang sat on it with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, which in a 6x8 cell is approximately the opposite wall. A corrections officer had passed twice in the last hour. Jang had not acknowledged either pass. He was building something in his mind, not a plan yet. Plans required information he did not yet have, but a framework. The skeleton of a structure that would become a plan once the right pieces arrived. The girl had Arthur's signal. That was the load-bearing fact. Everything else organized itself around it. Arthur Chad had been, in the technical vocabulary of Jang's organization, an asset. In the vocabulary Jang actually used when he was being honest with himself, Arthur had been something rarer, a man whose judgment he had trusted in a profession where trust is the scarcest and most dangerous commodity available. They had never been close in the conventional sense. They had met 7 times over 4 years. Each meeting had been brief, functional, and conducted with the mutual respect of 2 people who understood each other's constraints without requiring them to be explained. Arthur translated. Arthur observed. Arthur occasionally passed information that had saved Jang's organization from 3 separate ambushes. He had never asked for more than the agreed fee. He had never leveraged what he knew. He had, in the language of the world Jang operated in, been clean, which meant he was the kind of person whose death created an obligation. Jang did not deal in sentiment. He dealt in obligation. The distinction mattered. The lights in the cell block cut to half power at 10. The corridor went quiet. Jang waited 20 minutes after the last footstep faded before he moved to the back corner of the cell, the corner the camera covered least efficiently, a detail he had catalogued within the first hour of arrival. He reached under the lip of the cot frame where the weld met the wall bracket. What he found there was small enough to have passed 3 separate searches. A strip of paper no wider than a thumbnail, folded twice, pressed flat against the metal by a thumb that had been here recently. He had not arranged this. Someone in his organization had arranged it before he was even processed, which meant word had already moved faster than the court system. This was, professionally, gratifying. He unfolded the strip. 4 words in a hand he recognized as Darrow's compressed field script, perimeter set, awaiting instruction. Darrow had been at the waterfront. Darrow remembered Arthur. And Darrow, in 14 hours, had already found the girl and established a protective formation around her without being told to. Which meant Darrow had also heard about the courtroom, which meant the signal had been discussed somewhere in the network, which meant Jang had perhaps 12 hours before McFred's considerable intelligence apparatus picked up the same thread. 12 hours was not long. It was, however, sufficient for a man who had spent 30 years building a communication infrastructure, specifically designed to operate faster than the institutions trying to dismantle it. Jang tore the strip into 4 pieces, pressed them flat against the heel of his shoe, sat back on the cot, waited for morning. At 6:45, the block came back to full light and the morning rotation began. The corrections officer who unlocked Jang's cell for the breakfast transfer was a young man named Briggs, 3rd year, methodical, the kind of officer who follows procedure so precisely that procedure becomes, paradoxically, the thing that can be worked around. Jang had observed Briggs for 2 days. Briggs rotated his ring of keys in a specific pattern when he was managing multiple cell openings simultaneously. A clockwise half-turn before each lock, left hand steadying the door, right hand managing the key. In that half-second, his peripheral attention narrowed. Jang did not need much more than a half-second. As Briggs turned the lock, Jang stepped forward at the precisely appropriate moment and said, in a voice calibrated to conversational volume, "The attorney consultation room. I need an additional session this morning. Medical grounds." Briggs looked at him. Jang held eye contact with the specific quality of patience that communicates that this is not a negotiation but a scheduling issue. Briggs checked his clipboard, made a notation. "After breakfast," he said. Jang nodded. That was all he needed. The attorney consultation room was monitored by audio, but not by video. A legal concession to client privilege that created, for anyone who understood the room's architecture, a narrow but workable channel. Jang's attorney, a precise and deeply unamused man named Forspock, arrived at 8:15 with a leather briefcase and the expression of someone who has already billed for this morning and intends to bill considerably more before it ends. Jang let him arrange his papers. Then Jang slid a single sheet of yellow legal pad across the table, the pad that had been sitting on Forspock's side, and wrote 4 words. The butler had family. He underlined had, then below it present tense. Forspock looked at the words. His expression did not change, which was its own kind of change. He was a man who charged by the hour and asked no questions that were not strictly necessary to the defense. He uncapped his pen. Wrote below Jang's line, understood. Channel. Jang wrote a single name. Forspock looked at it, capped his pen, tore the sheet from the pad, folded it once, and placed it in the interior pocket of his briefcase with the practiced neutrality of a man filing a routine document. He then spent the next 40 minutes discussing trial procedure in full, audible detail for the benefit of the recording. Jang listened and contributed appropriately. When the session ended, Forspock left with his briefcase and his billing record and a folded sheet of yellow paper that would be delivered, by nightfall, to a woman named Sue in the 3rd District who ran a legitimate alterations shop and an illegitimate but extraordinarily efficient courier network. Sue had worked with Jang's organization for 11 years. She was 53, small, and possessed of the specific quality of invisibility that attaches to women of a certain age in a certain kind of neighborhood. Present everywhere, noticed nowhere, remembered by no one who matters. Her shop sat between a dry cleaner and a mobile phone repair stall on a street that saw high foot traffic and low police interest. She received Forcebox message at 7 that evening, read it in the back room with the door closed, and immediately made 3 phone calls and sent 2 messages through a platform the organization used that cycled its encryption key every 6 hours. By 9 that evening, the perimeter Darrow had established around Carol was no longer a perimeter. It was a network. There is a particular irony embedded in what was being constructed that night, that the most sophisticated protective infrastructure assembled for Carol Chad's safety was being built not by law enforcement, not by the court system, not by any of the institutions theoretically designed for exactly this purpose, but by the organization of the man accused of destroying her family. The state had assigned her Vera, a guardian with a caseload of 19 and a vehicle that struggled in cold weather. Jang had assigned her Darrow, 2 former military contractors working independently, a retired forensic accountant who monitored digital footprints, and Sue's network, which had eyes in 4 of the 6 districts McFred's private security team regularly operated in. This is not an argument for the righteousness of criminal organizations. It is an observation about what happens when institutions fail the people they are designed to protect. The vacuum does not remain empty. Something always moves into it. The only variable is what? Meanwhile, in a glass and steel office on the 44th floor of a building that bore his family's name in 4-foot bronze letters, Ronald McFred was having a conversation with a man named Priestley, his head of private security, former intelligence, the kind of professional who described his work in the language of asset management and liability reduction. McFred stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with his back to the room, looking at the city the way men look at things they consider extensions of themselves. "The girl was in the courtroom," Priestley said. He did not inflect it as a question because it was not a question. McFred said nothing for a moment. Then, "I was told the girl was not a factor," Priestley said. "She was not until yesterday." McFred turned from the window. His expression was not angry. Anger implies a loss of control, and McFred had not lost control of his expression in perhaps 20 years. He was something colder than angry. He was recalculating. "Then she becomes a factor to be managed," he said. "Quietly, thoroughly." Priestley nodded once and left. McFred turned back to the window. Below him, the city moved in its ordinary patterns. Traffic, commerce, the 10,000 small transactions of a functioning society. And none of it knew yet that it was operating inside a story whose shape was about to change. He was not wearing a mask. He was wearing the face of a man with nothing to hide, and he had worn it for so long it had stopped feeling like a choice. Back in the cell block, Jang lay on the cot with his eyes open and the light at half power, and the knowledge that his instructions had moved through 3 channels and reached their destinations. He was not comfortable. He was not at peace. He was doing the only thing available to him in a 6x8 room. He was thinking forward, past the trial, past the verdict, past the immediate architecture of the legal proceedings to the endgame. McFred had framed him with precision. Had stolen a specific piece from his collection, the jade cufflink, irreplaceable, Jang's own, and worn it during the massacre to deposit forensic evidence that pointed in one direction. It was a sophisticated operation. It was the operation of a man who had planned carefully and executed cleanly and left, as far as McFred knew, nothing behind. He was almost right. He had left one thing. A matching cufflink in the pocket of a girl who had spent 11 months counting upward in the dark, because her father had taught her that up does not stop. Jang had built an organization from nothing. He had done it by understanding one principle above all others. The most dangerous person in any situation is the one that everyone has already dismissed. McFred had dismissed Carol Chad 11 months ago. He was, as of this morning, paying someone to correct that error. But Darrow was already in position. Sue's network was already active, and somewhere across the city, in temporary housing with thin walls and a guardian with 19 cases and a car that struggled in cold weather, an 8-year-old girl with her father's signal in her left hand, and the evidence in her pocket was counting upward in the dark. She was not unprotected. She just didn't know it yet. Holloway had not filed a story in 14 months. This was not, strictly speaking, accurate. He had filed 3 pieces for a regional property supplement about commercial rezoning in the outer districts. work that paid the utilities and required approximately the same investigative instinct as reading a menu. But in the sense that mattered, in the sense that had once defined him, Holloway had not filed a real story in 14 months. The last real story had cost him his staff position at the city's largest investigative outlet, his press credentials with 2 federal agencies, and his marriage, in roughly that order and over roughly that period. The story had been about McFred. Specifically, it had been about a pattern of municipal contract irregularities that connected McFred's development company to a city councilman who had since retired to a property in the coastal districts that was worth considerably more than his pension explained. Holloway had spent 9 months on it. He had 4 sources. He had documentation. He had, he believed, the architecture of something significant. What he had not had was a final piece, the connective tissue between the financial pattern and a direct decision, the single provable link that would have transformed the story from sophisticated allegation to irrefutable fact. His editor had given him a deadline. The deadline arrived. The connective tissue had not. The story ran anyway, under pressure, and McFred's legal team had responded within 72 hours with a suit that did not ultimately succeed, but did not need to. The filing alone was sufficient to trigger a review. The review was sufficient to create institutional distance, and the distance had done the rest. Holloway's sources went quiet. His editor stopped returning calls with the same urgency. His credentials lapsed. His marriage, which had been surviving on the promise of a breakthrough that kept not arriving, stopped surviving. He was living now in a 2-room apartment above a laundry on Vester Street, working freelance, and spending a significant portion of his non-working hours doing what disgraced journalists do when they cannot stop being journalists, following threads that no one was paying him to follow, building files that lived in expandable folders on a desk that occupied most of his second room, maintaining the obsessive private cartography of a story he could not prove and could not abandon. He had a folder on the McFred estate massacre that was 4 inches thick. He had been at the courthouse the previous morning, not credentialed, not assigned, present on the basis of a tip from a court clerk he had cultivated over 3 years of coffee and patient conversation. The tip had been 3 words: bring your notebook. He had brought his notebook. He had sat in the back row of the gallery and watched Carol Chad walk to the witness stand, and he had watched her hand move, and he had watched Jang Jiwoo go completely still, and he had watched Judge Ola's gavel come down with a velocity that had nothing to do with routine procedure. He had written 4 lines in his notebook, and then stopped writing, because what was happening in front of him was moving faster than annotation. He had sat very still and watched and understood, with the particular physical certainty that good journalists describe as the story finding you rather than the reverse, that the connective tissue he had spent 9 months searching for had just walked into the room in an oversized cardigan. The problem was locating her afterward. Court records listed a guardian. The guardian's agency had a switchboard that routed to a voicemail. The voicemail had a response time measured in working days. Holloway had spent the previous evening working outward from the courthouse. The surrounding blocks, the transit routes a guardian with a ward would logically use, the temporary housing facilities within a 2-kilometer radius that accepted court-placed minors on short notice. There were 4. He had visited 3 before the second one's administrator had asked him to leave with a specificity that suggested he was not the first unfamiliar person to inquire that week, which was itself a piece of information. He found her on the 4th attempt, not inside the facility, outside it, in the narrow side passage between the building and the adjacent wall, where the facility's residents sometimes came to stand in open air without being fully visible from the street. She was sitting on an upturned milk crate with her knees together and her hands in her lap, looking at a pigeon that was investigating a crack in the pavement with the focused, methodical attention of something that has decided this crack is worth understanding completely. She did not look up when Holloway came around the corner. She looked up when he stopped moving, the specific alertness of someone whose threat detection had been recalibrated by experience. He did not crouch. He had been around enough traumatized children in enough conflict-adjacent reporting to know that adults who immediately crouch are performing reassurance for their own comfort rather than the child's. He stood at a non-confrontational distance and said, "That pigeon has been working that crack for about 3 minutes. I watched it from the street." Carol looked at him, then looked back at the pigeon. Holloway took this as provisional permission to remain. He leaned against the wall at a distance that gave her the geometry of the exit and said nothing further. The pigeon found what it was looking for, a fragment of something, and departed. Carol watched it go. Then she looked back at Holloway with the measuring directness that he was already beginning to understand was simply how she looked at everything. He said, "I was in the courtroom yesterday." He watched her hands. They did not move. He said, "I'm not from the court. I'm not from any agency. I'm a journalist, which currently means I'm a person with a large folder and no platform, which is a less useful combination than it sounds." Something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. He said, "I've been following McFred for 2 years. I got close once and it didn't go well for me." He paused. "I think you got closer than I did." He said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact that doesn't require performance. "And I think whatever you saw is still with you." Carol looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into the front pocket of her cardigan and closed her fingers around something he couldn't see, and held it there without producing it, and looked at him with an expression that he would later describe in his notes as the look of someone deciding whether a door is worth opening. He did not push. He had learned, in 14 months of professional diminishment, that the only things worth having are the ones that arrive because they choose to, not because they were pressured into it. She held his gaze for 7 full seconds. Then she took her hand out of her pocket without the object in it, stood up from the milk crate, and walked past him back toward the facility entrance. At the doorway, she stopped. Without turning around, she held up her left hand, 3 fingers folded inward, thumb flat, a small downward wave. Then she went inside. Holloway stood in the passage for a moment, very still, processing what had just happened. He had not recognized the signal. He had not been at the waterfront 6 years ago, had not moved in Jang's circles, did not carry the specific institutional memory that made the gesture legible. What he recognized was something else entirely, deliberate communication. A child who had not spoken publicly in 11 months had just communicated something to him with complete intentionality. She had not dismissed him. She had not reported him. She had given him a gesture whose meaning she expected him to work out, which meant she had already assessed him in the space of a 4-minute conversation and 7 seconds of direct eye contact, and arrived at a provisional conclusion. Not trust, something more preliminary than trust. Something like, "You might be useful." He took out his notebook. He wrote the signal down, the specific configuration, the motion, with the methodical accuracy of a man who has learned that the details you document immediately are the ones you still have when everything else becomes contested. Then he stood in the passage and thought about what he knew. He knew Carol had been at the estate on the night of the massacre. He knew she had survived. He knew she had sat in a federal courtroom and delivered a specific physical signal to a Mafia defendant that had stopped the proceedings entirely. He knew that McFred had been present in that same courtroom with the composure of a man attending someone else's problem. And he knew, from his 4-inch folder, that the forensic evidence anchoring the case against Jang, the jade cufflink recovered near the estate, was unique, irreplaceable. Registered to Jang's private collection through a specialist dealer in the Northern Quarter, whose records Holloway had spent 3 weeks obtaining through a Freedom of Information request that had been partially redacted. What the redacted sections had obscured were the acquisition details. What the unredacted sections had shown was that the piece was singular. One of 2 produced, both purchased by Jang, one catalogued as missing from his residence in the 6 months prior to the massacre. One of 2. Holloway walked back to his apartment on Vester Street with his notebook open and his pen moving. By the time he reached his desk, the shape of it was already assembling, the specific, kinetic architecture of a story finding its connective tissue at last. If the cufflink found at the scene was one of the pair, and it had been taken from Jang's collection prior to the massacre, then it had been planted. If it had been planted, then someone had accessed Jang's private residence, identified and extracted a specific irreplaceable object, and worn it to the scene with the deliberate intention of leaving forensic evidence pointing in one direction. That was not opportunistic framing. That was a sophisticated, premeditated operation that required foreknowledge of Jang's collection, access to his security, and the cold, strategic intelligence to execute a murder in a disguise designed to survive forensic scrutiny. It was the operation of a man with resources, patience, and a complete absence of anything resembling conscience. It was the operation of a man Holloway had been trying to prove for 2 years was exactly this kind of man. He opened his McFred folder. He found the acquisition record. He looked at it for a long time. Then he pulled a separate file, the estate staff records obtained through a source inside the city planning office who owed him a favor from a story 3 years prior. He found Arthur Chad's name. Position, head butler. Tenure, 6 years. Status, deceased October 14th. Next of kin listed, 1 dependent minor female. He sat back in his chair. The butler's daughter. She wasn't just a witness. She was the witness, the one person who had been inside the estate, inside the staff quarters, close enough to the event to have seen what the forensic team's report, which he had also obtained and which was also partially redacted, carefully did not address. The identity of the man in the corridor. The man whose silhouette matched no description of Jang Jiwoo that Holloway had ever encountered in 2 years of research, but matched, in the specific physical details Holloway had accumulated. Height, posture, the particular way of standing that attaches to men who have never doubted their authority in any room. One person precisely. He wrote McFred's name at the top of a clean page. He drew a line to Arthur Chad. He drew a line to Carol. He drew a line to the cufflink. He looked at the shape he had made. It was not yet proof. It was better than proof, it was a map. And somewhere in the front pocket of an oversized cardigan, the girl he had just met in a side passage was carrying the piece that turned the map into a verdict. The evidence wasn't on file. It had never been on file. It had been in her pocket for 11 months, and she had just told him so with a signal he didn't yet understand, but intended to by morning. He was already reaching for his phone when it rang. Unknown number. He answered. A voice he did not recognize said 4 words in a tone that left no room for misinterpretation. "Stay away from her." The line went dead. Holloway set the phone down on his desk, looked at his map, looked at McFred's name at the top of the page, picked the phone back up. He was not going to stay away from her. He was going to find out what her father's signal meant, and he was going to build the story that 2 years of careful, costly work had been pointing toward all along, and this time he was going to finish it. McFred had the police. McFred had the DA. McFred had private security and 14 months of Holloway's professional credibility already destroyed as a precautionary measure. What McFred did not have was the girl. Not yet, and not if Holloway had anything to say about it. Priestley ran his operation the way surgeons run a procedure, with economy of motion, precise sequencing, and a fundamental indifference to the material being worked on. He had spent 11 years in government intelligence before McFred had offered him a number that made institutional loyalty feel like a hobby. In that time, he had managed 14 operations that his former employer would have described, in the sanitized vocabulary of classified documentation, as liability containment. He did not use that language himself. He used simpler language. He had a problem. He was going to solve it. The problem had a name. Carol Chad, 8 years old. Temporary housing, Vester Street District. Guardian assigned by family court, caseload of 19, vehicle unreliable in cold weather. He had the address by 6 that morning. He had a 2-man team assigned by 7. He had given them one instruction, delivered in the flat, unornamented cadence he used for all instructions. Quiet, clean, no courthouse footprint. The team, a man called Reiser and a man called Toft, both former private contractors, both recommended through channels that did not generate paper trails, had acknowledged and departed. Priestley had then poured himself a coffee, reviewed 2 other unrelated files, and proceeded with his morning on the assumption that the problem would be resolved before noon. He was not a careless man. He had simply never encountered a problem that came pre-surrounded. Dora'sArchives first. Dara was occupying the driver's seat of a vehicle that had been parked on Vester Street since the previous evening, not directly opposite the facility, which would have been visible, but half a block north with sightlines to both approach routes. He was a large, quiet man who had worked with Jang for 9 years and who possessed, among other qualities, an almost architectural patience. He had been watching the street since 5 in the morning with a coffee thermos and the specific attentiveness of someone who has been told that what they are protecting matters. He clocked Riser at 7:43, wrong shoes for the neighborhood, gait too controlled for a civilian morning, eyes doing the systematic sweep of a man conducting a threat assessment rather than walking to work. Darrow made a call. 30 seconds later, a woman named Petra, who had been stationed in the laundry below Holloway's apartment since the previous night, repositioned to the facility's service entrance. Simultaneously, a man named Voss, who had been sitting in the facility's small common room presenting himself as a maintenance contractor. A cover arranged through Sue's network with the facility's overnight administrator, who owed Sue a favor of the financial variety, stood up from his chair and moved to the corridor outside Carol's room. None of this was visible. That was the point. Riser reached the facility's front entrance at 7:51. He did not enter immediately. He stood at the door for 40 seconds, which is 39 seconds longer than a person with legitimate business stands at a door. Darrow photographed him from the vehicle. Toft appeared at the southern approach 4 minutes later, moving toward the building's side access. Petra, already at the service entrance, watched him come and did not move. She sent a message to Darrow, "2 confirmed." Darrow sent a message through Sue's channel to Forcebox office, where it would be relayed in the morning briefing to Jang's holding cell through a mechanism that had already been established. The message was 3 words: contact made, holding. Inside the facility, Carol was awake. She had been awake since 5, not from anxiety, or not only from anxiety, but from the habit of early waking that had attached itself to her in the months since the estate, the body's own security system running its checks before the day officially began. She was sitting on her bed with her knees drawn up and the cufflink in her palm, which was how she spent the first 20 minutes of most mornings, not examining it, not turning it over, simply holding it the way you hold something that anchors you to a decision you have already made. The morning light through the thin curtains was the pale, provisional light of early winter. She could hear the facility coming to life around her. A door, a faucet, someone in the adjacent room moving furniture with the inconsiderate energy of a person who has forgotten other people exist. She heard Voss position himself in the corridor because she heard everything. She did not know who Voss was. She knew he was not facility staff. His footsteps had a different distribution of weight than the staff members she had catalogued over the past week, heavier at the heel, the walk of someone who stood for long periods professionally. She closed her fist around the cufflink, listened. He was not approaching her door. He was stationed outside it, facing outward. Which meant whatever he was managing was on the other side of him, not on her side. She understood, without being told, that the morning had changed. This is the operational reality of what is called in security literature a close protection environment, a layered system of human assets positioned to intercept threats before they reach the principal. The principal, in this context, was an 8-year-old girl who had no knowledge that the system existed, could not have articulated what a close protection environment was, and was nonetheless responding to its presence with the instinctive threat calibration of someone whose survival architecture had been significantly upgraded by 11 months of operating alone in dangerous proximity to powerful people. Children who survive acute violence do not emerge from the experience unchanged. The research on this is unambiguous. What changes is not only psychological. The nervous system itself recalibrates, raising baseline alertness, sharpening peripheral attention, accelerating the processing of environmental anomaly. Carol Chad had spent 11 months in a state of continuous low-grade threat assessment. She was, in the vocabulary of trauma research, hypervigilant. In the vocabulary of what was currently happening on Vester Street, she was exactly the right person to be hypervigilant. She got dressed. She put the cufflink in her cardigan pocket. She sat on the bed and waited. At 8:12, Riser abandoned the front entrance and moved to the east side of the building, a decision that suggested he had received instructions to change approach. Darrow photographed the repositioning and sent an updated message. Toft, at the service entrance, had been in a static position for 19 minutes, which was too long. Petra moved to intercept his sightline, not confrontationally, simply a woman standing in a doorway smoking a cigarette, occupying space in a way that made the service entrance operationally inconvenient. Toft held his position. He was patient. So was Petra. This continued for 11 minutes. Then Toft's phone vibrated. Darrow could not know this, but the timing of what happened next made it the most probable explanation, and Toft turned and walked back the way he had come. Reiser, simultaneously, crossed back to the north side and disappeared around the corner. Withdrawal, not abandonment, tactical reassessment. They would return with better information and a modified approach. Priestley did not send amateurs, and he did not accept first-attempt failures as final outcomes. Darrow sent the updated status through channels. Then he got out of the vehicle for the first time in 3 hours, stretched once, and walked to a payphone 2 blocks north. A payphone he had identified 2 days prior as functional, which in the current era was the kind of detail only people in Darrow's specific profession still bothered to identify. He made a call. 4 rings. A voice answered, not Sue, someone further along the chain. Darrow said, "Tell him they came. Tell him they pulled back. Tell him the girl needs to move by tonight." He hung up, walked back to the vehicle, poured the last of his thermos coffee. The message reached Jang's cell through Forsbach's morning briefing at 9:45. Jang read it in the attorney consultation room with Forsbach present and saying nothing. Forsbach had reached an operational equilibrium with this arrangement that involved billing his full hourly rate and maintaining a studied ignorance of anything he did not strictly need to know. Jang looked at the message for 30 seconds. Then he wrote on the yellow pad, "Move her to the archive location. Holloway goes with her." He underlined Holloway. Forsbach looked at the name, raised an eyebrow by approximately 2 millimeters, which for Forsbach was the equivalent of an extended expression of surprise. He wrote, "The journalist?" Jang wrote, "He was at the waterfront once. He knows what Arthur's signal means." This was not precisely true. Holloway had not yet decoded the signal, but Jang was operating on a longer read of the situation. A journalist who had spent 2 years investigating McFred and had found the girl within 48 hours of the courtroom signal was not a liability. He was a resource. He was, specifically, the resource that Jang could not be himself from inside a federal holding cell. He needed someone on the outside who could move freely, who understood the evidentiary architecture of the case, and who had sufficient personal investment in McFred's exposure to override the rational instinct for self-preservation. Holloway qualified on all 3 counts. The fact that McFred had already tried to destroy him professionally was, from Jang's perspective, an asset. Men with nothing left to lose make the most committed investigators. Forsbach folded the page. Left. Jang sat alone in the consultation room for the remaining 12 minutes of the session and thought about the archive location, a property in the Eastern District that his organization had used for document storage before a procedural change 18 months prior had made it redundant. Off the books, structurally sound, not connected to any name in any current file. It was the right place. It was not a comfortable place. Carol had been in uncomfortable places before. On Vester Street, Holloway had been watching the building from his apartment window since 7 that morning. He had seen Reiser. He had seen Toft. He had not known their names, but he had recognized their operational signature. The controlled positioning, the systematic approach, the too long pause at the entrance, because he had spent 3 years covering conflict-adjacent stories in regions where private contractors worked openly and had learned to read their physical grammar. He had taken photographs through his window with a long lens left over from an assignment 2 years prior. He had sent the photographs to a former colleague at the federal crime desk with a message that said simply, "Identify these men if you can." He was waiting for a response when his phone rang. Unknown number. Different unknown number from the previous evening, different prefix, different regional code. He answered. The voice was not the same voice as before. This one was younger, unhurried, carrying the specific quality of someone delivering a message they have memorized rather than composed. It said, "The girl needs to move tonight. You're going with her. Be outside the facility's east exit at 9 this evening. Come alone. Bring your folder." A pause, then. "Arthur Chad used that signal at the Meridian docks in 2019. Jang taught it to him. Now you know what it means." The line went dead. Holloway set the phone down, looked at his window, looked at the photograph of Reiser still open on his camera screen, looked at his McFred folder on the desk, 4 inches thick, 2 years of work, 14 months of professional wreckage. He thought about the voice on the phone, about Jang teaching Arthur a private signal, about the girl in the side passage holding something in her pocket she had not shown him. He thought about the fact that McFred had sent 2 men to a building, housing an 8-year-old ward of the court before 9 in the morning, which was the action of a man who had moved from strategic patience to urgency, which meant McFred was no longer certain he controlled the timeline, which meant something in the previous 48 hours had frightened him. Good, Holloway thought, he should be frightened. He reached for his folder, started selecting which documents traveled with him tonight and which stayed in the apartment as redundant copies. He worked methodically, with the focus of someone who has been waiting for the moment to arrive and is now simply executing the preparation he has been running through in his mind for 14 months. At some point his phone buzzed, his former colleague at the Federal Crime Desk, responding to the photographs. The message said, Reiser. Former contractor, 3 confirmed operations in the southern districts. Currently listed as private security, McFred Holdings. Holloway looked at the name. McFred Holdings, no longer a thread, a rope. He added the message to his folder, closed it, and set it by the door. He wasn't a man with nothing left to lose. He was a man who had lost everything on the first attempt and was now, with considerably better material, lining up the second. She knows what McFred did. He knows she knows. And tonight, 2 outcasts and an 8-year-old girl are going to disappear into the city while the most powerful man in it decides how much blood he is willing to spill to keep his secret. The archive location was a narrow 3-story building in the Eastern District that smelled of damp paper and the particular mineral coldness of a space that had been heated intermittently for years and remembered warmth only as an occasional visitor. The ground floor held metal shelving units, still carrying the ghost inventory of Jang's former document operation, empty binders, plastic sleeves, the organizational residue of a system that had been dismantled carefully rather than abandoned. The second floor had 2 rooms with functional locks and windows that faced the interior courtyard rather than the street, which was the architectural feature that had made the property useful in the first place. Holloway had arrived at 9:14 the previous evening with his folder and a bag containing 2 days of supplies. Carol had arrived 12 minutes later with Voss, who had delivered her without introduction, confirmed Holloway's presence with a look that communicated both assessment and provisional approval, and departed without a word. Vera, the Guardian, had been managed through Sue's network via a communication Holloway did not ask to see the details of. The result being that Vera had received an official-looking court notification of a temporary placement adjustment that would occupy her administrative attention for at least 48 hours before the inconsistency surfaced. They had been in the archive for 16 hours when Carol made her decision. Holloway had spent those 16 hours at the folding table he had positioned under the second floor's better window, working through his folder with the systematic attention of a man reassembling something he had previously built incorrectly. Carol had spent them in the adjacent room initially, then progressively closer to the doorway, then in the doorway itself, watching him work. He had not invited her to watch. He had not discouraged it. He had simply continued working, narrating occasionally when something seemed worth narrating, not to her specifically, more in the manner of a person who thinks aloud and has stopped being self-conscious about it. He said things like, "The acquisition record shows 2 pieces, both purchased by the same collector, but only one appears in the evidence manifest, statements that required no response and received none but that were, he understood, being processed by the person in the doorway with considerable attention." He was, deliberately and without making it explicit, laying the map out where she could see it. On the second morning, she came and stood beside the table and looked at the documents arranged across it. He did not move them or explain them. She looked at the acquisition record for the cufflinks, the partially redacted document with the specialist dealer's letterhead, for a long time. Then she reached into her cardigan pocket and placed the cufflink on the table next to the document. Set it down with the same deliberate care she used for everything breakable. The engraved initials faced upward. The dark stain along one edge caught the window light. Holloway looked at it, then looked at the acquisition record, then back at the cufflink. The engraving matched the catalog description with the precision of something that had been made to match nothing else in the world. He said very quietly, "You've had this since that night." It was not a question. Carol looked at him, said nothing. He said, "This is the second piece. The matching one is in the evidence locker." He paused. Together they prove the one at the scene was planted. He said it plainly, without drama, the way you state the conclusion of a proof once the steps have been laid out. Without this, the case against Jang holds. With this, the entire forensic foundation collapses. He looked at her. "You knew that." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked back at the cufflink. He understood, in that moment, that she had known it for 11 months. Had understood the weight of what she was carrying not in legal vocabulary, but in the simpler, more absolute vocabulary of a child who watched her father walk toward something irreversible, and had been holding the proof of it in her pocket ever since, waiting for the moment when producing it would accomplish something rather than simply making her a more urgent target. She had been waiting for a map. He had laid one out. Now she was showing him the piece that completed it. He reached for his notebook. She put her hand flat on the table, not on the cufflink beside it. A small, clear gesture. Not yet. He withdrew his notebook. She picked the cufflink up and returned it to her pocket. He understood. Documentation would come. First, she needed something else. She looked at him with the measuring directness he had catalogued since their first meeting and said nothing. Then she pointed at the acquisition record. Specifically at the redacted section, the black bars obscuring the acquisition pathway. He looked at it, looked at her, said, "You want to know where he got it from?" She held his gaze. He said, "The estate." She already knew. She was confirming it. Here is what the redacted section of the acquisition record contained, which Holloway had obtained through a source inside the specialist dealer's firm 3 days later, but understood structurally in that moment. The second cufflink, the one that ended up in the evidence locker, had been removed from Jang's private display case during a period when McFred had hosted Jang at a formal dinner 14 months before the massacre. A dinner at the McFred estate. A dinner at which Arthur Chad had served. A dinner Holloway had a photograph of, buried in his folder, showing McFred and Jang at the same table with the specific social proximity of men conducting a negotiation disguised as hospitality. McFred had used the occasion to access Jang's case, not directly, but through a member of his household staff who had accompanied Jang and whose loyalties McFred had been cultivating for months prior. The piece had been removed, catalogued privately, and stored for future use. McFred had been planning the framing not for weeks, but for over a year. The massacre had not been impulsive. It had been the conclusion of a long, patient construction. The final movement of an operation so elaborate it had required a dinner party, a planted contact, a stolen heirloom, and a disguise assembled to forensic specification. It was the operation of a man who considered everything, accounted for every variable, and had arrived at the massacre with the absolute confidence of someone who had already written the ending. He had written Carol out of it entirely. She had not been a variable because she had not been visible. She was the butler's daughter. She sorted linen in the pantry. She drew birds in notebooks. She was 8 years old and she was not in the plan. The best-laid plans, McFred was discovering, have a persistent vulnerability to the things they dismiss. Carol stood at the table for another moment. Then she looked at the window. The Eastern District's morning light was the thin, specific light of a city that has not decided yet what kind of day it intends to be. She looked at it with an expression Holloway could not fully read, something between resolution and the specific gravity of a decision arriving at its execution point. He said, "Whatever you're thinking, tell me before you do it." She looked at him. Then she crossed to the shelving unit along the wall and found, on the third shelf, a piece of paper and a pen that the previous operation had left behind. She wrote 2 words and brought the paper back to the table, set it in front of him. He looked at it. It said, "The estate." He looked up at her. She was already watching him with the patience of someone who has made their decision and is now simply waiting for the other party to catch up. He said, "Carol." She looked at him steadily. He said, McFred's security team came to your facility yesterday morning. They know you exist. The estate is the first place they'll expect. She wrote on the paper below her first two words, boot room floor. He read it, looked at her. She wrote, he dropped something else. Holloway was quiet for a long moment. She wrote, I only took one. He sat back in his chair, processed this. She had been in that boot room in the dark on the worst night of her life, and she had picked up one object from the floor, and she had been living with the knowledge that there was a second one. Something else McFred had dropped, something she had seen but not taken, something that was still there in a boot room in a house that McFred occupied and controlled and patrolled with private security. She had been carrying that knowledge alongside the cufflink for 11 months with the same quiet, devastating patience she brought to everything. She hadn't told Vera. She hadn't told the trauma specialist. She had walked it into the courtroom and signaled Jang and found Holloway and laid the map out piece by piece with the methodical precision of someone who had learned from the best cataloger she had ever known, her father. That the details you document carefully are the ones you still have when everything else is contested. Holloway looked at her for a long time. Then he said, You're not going back there alone. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she had not planned to. They left the archive at 11 that evening. Voss drove. Darrow had repositioned to cover the archive's perimeter in their absence. The McFred estate sat in the northern quarter, behind a gate system and a half-kilometer of maintained driveway, surrounded by grounds that McFred's security team patrolled on a rotation Holloway had partially mapped from his original investigation. Partially was not completely. He was aware of this. He kept his folder on his lap in the vehicle and reviewed the patrol notes by phone light, while the city moved past the windows in the specific, indifferent way cities move past people attempting things that cities would not endorse if asked. Carol sat beside him and looked out the window. She was not visibly frightened. She was doing what she had been doing since October 14th, counting upward, invisibly, in the oldest and most reliable part of herself, keeping the mind moving because up does not stop. The estate's outer perimeter appeared through the vehicle window at 11:40, the iron fence line, the manicured boundary trees, the distant geometry of the building's east wing against the sky. She looked at it with the specific quality of attention she gave to things she had already decided about. The boot room was on the estate's service side. The service side had a gate that the kitchen delivery vehicles used, and that was operated by a keypad rather than the main security desk. Arthur had known the code. Arthur had given it to her once, casually, the way parents give children information they might need. Not because they expect the need to arise, but because information held is always preferable to information absent. She had not forgotten it. She did not forget things. Voss stopped the vehicle 200 meters short of the service gate, looked in the rearview mirror at Holloway. Holloway looked at Carol. She was already reaching for the door handle, with the quiet, forward motion of someone executing a plan they have been running in their mind for 11 months. And the only question remaining, the question that Holloway felt in the specific, physical location where professional instinct lives, was what McFred had left on that boot room floor, and whether it was still there. And whether the most carefully constructed alibi in the city was about to come apart on the tile of a room that its architect had never considered worth securing. Because the butler had taught his daughter to notice everything. And everything, it turned out, included the things that powerful men drop when they believe no one is watching. The service gate keypad waited 30 meters ahead. Carol's hand was on the door. The estate was dark except for the security rotation's moving light, sweeping the grounds in the methodical arc of a system designed by a man who had accounted for every variable. Every variable except her. The service gate accepted the code on the first attempt. Holloway had not been certain it would. Codes change. Security systems get upgraded. Estates owned by men who have recently sent contractors to silence a child witness tend to have their access protocols reviewed. But Arthur Chad had given his daughter a code that still worked 11 months after his death, which meant either McFred's security team had not identified it as a vulnerability, or, more likely, and more chilling, McFred had not considered the service entrance worth upgrading, because he had not considered anyone who knew the code to still be a relevant problem. The gate swung inward with the smooth, well-maintained motion of expensive hardware, and Carol walked through it with the same forward, decided quality she brought to everything. And Holloway followed 2 steps behind with his phone in his pocket and his notebook in his jacket, and the specific, full-body alertness of a man who is doing something irreversible and has made his peace with that. Voss remained with the vehicle. This had been the arrangement, not discussed explicitly, simply understood through the operational grammar that Jang's people communicated in. If they were not back in 40 minutes, Voss would make a call. What happened after that call was not something Holloway had asked to have explained to him. Some information is most useful in its absence. The service path ran along the estate's eastern boundary, a gravel track bordered by hedging that muffled footsteps adequately and provided enough lateral cover to make the walk manageable if the security rotation maintained its pattern. Holloway had timed the rotation from his original investigation notes. 17 minutes between passes on the eastern side, adjusted for the patrol's start point. They had entered at the rotation's furthest point. They had approximately 14 minutes before the next pass. The boot room was 60 meters along the service path and through the staff entrance, a heavy door with a mechanical lock that Arthur's code did not cover. Carol walked to it without hesitation and produced a key from the inside of her cardigan cuff. Holloway looked at it. She looked at him with the expression that said, "My father's." He nodded. She unlocked the door. They went in. The boot room was exactly as she had described it, and nothing like Holloway had imagined it. He had constructed a mental image from his investigation notes, a utilitarian service space, functional, anonymous. What he encountered was something more specific, a narrow room with tile floors and dark wood paneling, and a row of hooks along one wall still holding outdoor coats belonging to staff who no longer came to collect them. The room smelled of rubber and cedar, and the faint, ghost layer of cleaning product applied over something that had been cleaned with urgency rather than routine. The tile near the baseboard along the far wall had a slightly different reflective quality than the surrounding floor newer grout, recently resealed, the kind of remediation that happens when a surface has retained something that needed not to be retained. Carol stood in the center of the room. She did not move immediately. She was orienting, locating herself in the geography of a night she had navigated in darkness and terror, and the specific tunnel vision of a child executing the last instruction her father had given her. Holloway stood still and let her orient. He had learned in the past 16 hours that the most useful thing he could do in Carol's presence was manage his own impulse to direct and simply remain available for what she needed when she needed it. She was not a source to be managed. She was the investigator. He was the resource. She moved to the baseboard along the far wall, crouched, ran her fingers along the tile edge, not searching, confirming. She knew precisely where she was going. She had replayed this room 10,000 times in the dark of temporary housing and the archive's second floor and every counting session since October 14th. Her hand stopped at a specific point approximately 40 centimeters from the wall's corner. She looked up at Holloway, pointed. He crouched beside her. In the gap between the baseboard and the tile, a gap of perhaps 3 millimeters, the kind of tolerance that exists in older construction where materials have settled into their permanent disagreements, something caught his phone's light. Small, metallic, compressed into the gap by the pressure of a boot sole that had stepped on it and driven it flush with the floor without registering the contact. Holloway reached into his jacket pocket for the slim forensic tweezers he had added to his kit that morning on an instinct he was now grateful for. He worked the object free from the gap with the care of someone who understands that physical evidence handled incorrectly is evidence handed to the opposing argument. It came loose in 2 careful movements. He held it under the phone light. A button. Not a standard button, a bespoke button, the kind attached to a garment that has been made rather than purchased. Dark material, almost black, with a specific weave pattern pressed into its face and a backing stamp so small he had to bring the phone within 3 centimeters to read it. He read it, looked at Holloway. She pointed at his notebook. He understood. He opened the notebook and wrote the stamp text exactly as it appeared. Renner and Holt, Commission Series, Pattern 7. He underlined it. Looked at Carol. She nodded once, with the quality of someone confirming that what has just been found is what they knew would be found, not relief, because relief implies uncertainty, and she had not been uncertain about this room for 11 months. He bagged the button in a small evidence sleeve from his kit, stood, looked at Carol. She was already standing, already looking at the door, the forward motion reasserting itself. They had used 9 of their 14 minutes. He followed her out. They were back at the vehicle, with 4 minutes remaining on the rotation. In the archive the following morning, Holloway opened his laptop and ran the stamped text through every relevant database he had access to, which after 2 years of investigative work and the cultivation of sources across 4 industries was a more extensive list than his current professional status suggested. Renner and Holt was a bespoke tailoring house operating from a single premises in the Northern Quarter, appointment-only, commission-based, clientele list not public, waiting period for new commissions 18 months minimum. Pattern 7 in their commission series was a specific construction, a suit design registered under that designation for a single client, meaning the pattern existed for one person and one person only. The button was not from a suit. It was from a disguise, or more precisely, from the suit that McFred had commissioned to resemble Jang Jiwoo's signature aesthetic with sufficient forensic plausibility to survive a crime scene. Jang's look was documented extensively. Court records, surveillance photography, the accumulated visual record of a man who had operated publicly for 20 years. McFred had taken that documentation to a tailor and had a single garment constructed to specification, worn it on one specific night, and disposed of it afterward. All except one button, which had separated from the garment during the massacre and traveled across the boot room floor and lodged itself in a baseboard gap that McFred's remediation team had cleaned around without locating. Pattern 7, one client. The client's name was behind an appointment-only privacy policy and a clientele list that was not public. Holloway looked at the stamped text in his notebook for a long time. Then he reached for his phone and called a number he had not used in 14 months. A former colleague named Wren, who had left investigative journalism for fashion industry consulting, and who knew the tailoring world's internal architecture with the specific fluency of someone who had spent a decade reporting on it before pivoting. The phone rang 4 times. Wren answered with the cautious tone of someone who has received unexpected calls before and learned to approach them carefully. Holloway said, "Renner and Holt, commission series, I need to know who holds pattern 7. Silence on the line. Then Wren said, "That's a sealed client record." Holloway said, "I know what it is, I need to know who it is." Another silence. Wren said, "Why?" Holloway said, "Because a child watched her father die and has been carrying the proof of who did it in her pocket for 11 months, and I am not going to let the story die on a tailoring house privacy policy." The silence this time was different in quality, the silence of someone recalibrating rather than resisting. Wren said, "Give me until this evening." Carol was at the folding table when he ended the call. She had been there since early morning, working through something that Holloway had not immediately identified. A systematic arrangement of objects and papers that he gradually understood was her own version of the map he had been building. She had taken his acquisition record copy, his estate staff photograph, his patrol timing notes, and arranged them in a sequence that followed not the documentary logic he had used but a different logic entirely, the logic of a witness, the logic of physical and sensory memory, the sequence of what she had experienced rather than what could be proven. He stood beside the table and looked at her arrangement. It was not the same map as his. It was a better one. It had a dimension his lacked, the dimension of someone who had been present, who had smelled the cigar smoke and seen the silhouette and felt the boot room tile under her feet and known, in the oldest part of herself, which details mattered before she had the vocabulary to explain why. He said, "Can I photograph this?" She looked at him, nodded once. He photographed it from 3 angles. Then he said, "The button is from a commissioned suit. One client. I'm waiting on the name." She looked at the arrangement on the table. Then she reached into her cardigan and placed the cufflink beside the button evidence sleeve, the 2 objects side by side, the full physical record of what McFred had left behind on the night he had been so certain he had left nothing. Together they occupied perhaps 6 centimeters of table space. They represented, in that 6 centimeters, the complete demolition of the most carefully constructed false narrative in the city's recent legal history. Here is what forensic documentation achieves that witness testimony alone cannot. It removes the element of interpretation. A witness can be discredited, their memory questioned, their trauma weaponized against their credibility, their age used as an argument against their reliability. Physical evidence, properly documented and chain of custody established, does not have a trauma history. It does not have selective mutism. It cannot be characterized as unreliable by a defense attorney with a velvet voice and a billing rate that exceeds most people's monthly income. A button from a single commission suit ties a garment to a tailor to a client with the specificity of a fingerprint. A cufflink from a matched pair ties a planted object to its origin with the same specificity. Together, in the hands of a competent prosecutor who is not operating under McFred's influence, and Delia Forsyth, Holloway had confirmed, was not. She was ambitious and clean and had been handed a compromised case and was defending it in good faith because she did not yet know it was compromised. Together, they were not just evidence. They were the case. Wren called at 7:14 that evening. Holloway answered on the first ring. Wren said, "Pattern 7 is registered to a holding company. The holding company has one beneficial owner." A pause. "Ronald McFred." Holloway wrote the name at the top of a clean page, drew a line to the button, drew a line to the cufflink, drew a line to Arthur Chad, drew a line to Carol, looked at the shape. It was no longer a map. It was a verdict. He looked up. Carol was watching him from across the table with the absolute, patient attention of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment to arrive and has just recognized it. He turned the notebook around so she could read McFred's name at the top of the page. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at him. Her expression did not change, not triumph, not relief, not the cathartic release that the moment might have warranted in a different kind of story. It was something quieter and more durable than any of those things. It was the expression of someone who has been right about something terrible for 11 months and has just watched the world catch up. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was wearing a commissioned suit with one button missing, and now they had the button. There was one remaining problem. Delia Forsyth was prosecuting the wrong man in a trial that was resuming in 72 hours. The evidence in Holloway's folder and on this table needed to reach her without passing through any channel that McFred monitored, influenced, or owned, which eliminated the police, the DA's office intake, and 3 of the 4 methods Holloway would normally use to deliver material to a sitting prosecutor. It needed to arrive clean, documented, and accompanied by a witness who could place every object in its evidentiary context. It needed, in other words, to arrive at the McFred Gala, the event scheduled for the evening before the trial resumed, the event that McFred held annually at the estate, the event that Jang's lieutenants had already identified as the one moment in the next 72 hours when McFred's security would be distributed across a large space, managing a civilian crowd, rather than concentrated on a single perimeter. The one moment when the estate's interior would be accessible to people who had been invited, and to people who were very good at appearing to have been invited. Holloway looked at his folder, looked at the evidence on the table, looked at Carol, said, "There's a gala tomorrow night." She looked at him with an expression that said she already knew. She had, after all, grown up inside those walls. She knew the estate's layout, its rhythms, its staff rotations, its internal geography in the specific, cellular way that children know the places they have inhabited, not as a floor plan, but as a lived experience, every corridor memorized not from a map, but from the 1,000 ordinary transits of a childhood spent in service quarters. She knew exactly which room McFred used as his private study. She knew which door connected the service corridor to the main hall without passing through the gala's central space. She knew where the estate's internal recording system routed its feed, because Arthur had shown her once, casually, the way he showed her everything worth knowing. She wrote on the paper between them, "I know a way in." Then below it, with the calm finality of someone closing the last distance between the beginning of a thing and its end, "He won't see us coming." The gala began at 8. By 7:45, The estate's main driveway held a procession of vehicles that collectively represented more capital than the Eastern District's entire annual infrastructure budget. The catering staff had been on site since noon. The floral arrangements, 17 of them, each commissioned from a single atelier in the northern quarter, had arrived at 3. The string quartet had sound-checked at 5 and was now positioned in the estate's east drawing room, producing the specific kind of music that functions not as entertainment, but as acoustic furniture, filling space, so that the absence of genuine conversation is less audible. Ronald McFred stood at the foot of the main staircase in a black evening suit and received his guests with the warmth of a man who has rehearsed warmth until it became indistinguishable from the genuine article. He shook hands. He remembered names. He laughed at the appropriate moments with the appropriate volume. He was, to every person who passed through his door that evening, the living definition of a host, generous, present, at complete ease in his own house. He had not slept in 31 hours. Priestley had briefed him at 6 that morning with the information that Reiser and Toft had lost the girl, that she had been relocated by an unknown party operating with professional efficiency, and that the journalist, Holloway, had vacated his Vester Street apartment sometime the previous evening and had not been relocated. McFred had listened to this briefing, standing at his office window in the same position he occupied for all difficult information, his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him. When Priestley finished, McFred had said nothing for 40 seconds. Then he said, "They're coming here," Priestley had said. "The gala is a significant security exposure." McFred had turned from the window and looked at him with the specific quality of finality that ended discussions. "Cancel the gala and I signal weakness to every person on that guest list. Reschedule it and I create 48 hours in which my absence is remarked upon by the people whose opinion of me is currently the only thing protecting this." He had turned back to the window. "Double the interior team, tighten the service entrance rotation, and find the girl before she finds a reason to be found." Priestley had nodded and left. McFred had remained at the window for another 20 minutes, thinking about variables and the persistent human failure to account for them sufficiently. Then he had gone to dress for the evening. He was almost certain he had this contained, almost was doing considerable work in that sentence. The service entrance code had been changed at 4 that afternoon. Priestley had identified it as the most probable access point for anyone with knowledge of the estate's secondary systems and had rotated the code to a new 6-digit sequence known only to himself and the 2 contractors now stationed at the service gate. He was confident in this. What he had not accounted for, what no security assessment of the estate had ever mapped, was the coal chute. The coal chute was a relic of the estate's original construction, sealed in the 1970s when the building converted to central heating, located on the northern face behind the hedging that ran parallel to the service path. It connected to a sub-level utility corridor that ran under the kitchen and emerged through a locked door into the boot room. Arthur Chad had found it during his 3rd year at the estate when a structural survey had temporarily removed a section of the northern hedging and exposed the sealed iron plate. He had said nothing to McFred about it. He had, characteristically, filed it in his own private catalog of information held rather than shared. He had shown it to Carol on a Sunday afternoon when the estate was quiet, the way he showed her everything worth knowing, without preamble, without explanation beyond the practical, with the implicit message that the world rewards people who know the geography of the places they inhabit. She had not forgotten it. She did not forget things. Holloway had not known about the coal chute until 40 minutes before they left the archive, when Carol had drawn him a diagram on the paper they had been using all week, a clean, precise diagram with proportional distances, and notated entry points that Arthur would have recognized as his own methodology reflected in his daughter's hand. Holloway had studied it for 3 minutes. Then he had looked at her and said, "Your father showed you this." She had looked back at him steadily. He said, "He was preparing you for something he didn't name." She said nothing. He had understood in that silence that Arthur Chad had spent years quietly equipping his daughter with the knowledge and instincts required to survive a world that was more dangerous than it presented itself as being. A man in Jang's orbit, translating at the edges of a city's criminal architecture, knows the shape of the risks surrounding him even when he cannot name their timeline. Arthur had known something was building. He had not known what form it would take. He had simply ensured that whatever form it took, his daughter would not be entirely unprepared for it. They approached the northern face at 8:22. The gala's acoustic footprint, the murmur of 100 guests, the string quartet's middle register, was audible from the hedging line, which meant the ambient noise was working in their favor. Darrow had repositioned to cover the northern perimeter, which meant the service path behind them was clean. Voss was at the vehicle, engine running, for the extraction. The arrangement had the functional elegance of a plan built by people who understand that the best operations are the ones with the fewest moving parts that still accomplish what needs to be accomplished. Carol located the iron plate in 12 seconds. She had not been to this spot in over a year, but her hands found it with the navigational certainty of muscle memory, reaching through the lower hedging, fingers reading the ground, finding the plate's edge and the recessed handle beneath the leaf debris. Holloway cleared the debris. The plate lifted with the grinding reluctance of metal that has not moved in months, loud enough that both of them went still for 3 seconds and listened. The gala's ambient noise absorbed it. Holloway went in first. He had insisted on this, not as gallantry but as operational logic, his shoulders the relevant variable for the chute's width. He fit with approximately 4 centimeters of clearance. He moved through on his elbows with his folder pressed against his chest and his phone dark. Carol followed with the compact efficiency of someone significantly better suited to the chute's dimensions, pulling the plate back into position behind her with a precision that produced no sound. The utility corridor smelled of old stone and pipe insulation, and the deep, accumulated cold of a space that exists below the level of human habitation. Holloway used his phone's light for 15 seconds to orient against Carol's diagram, then killed it. Carol moved ahead of him. This was her geography, not his, and he had the professional self-awareness to recognize when expertise transfers and when it does not. She navigated the corridor by touch and memory, one hand on the wall, pace even, and Holloway followed the sound of her footsteps with the trust of someone who has spent the past 3 days watching a child demonstrate consistently superior judgment and has adjusted his assessment accordingly. The boot room door lock was mechanical, the same lock Arthur's key had opened 4 nights prior. Carol had the key. The door opened inward into the boot room's familiar cedar and rubber atmosphere. They were inside. The estate above them was in full operation. Footsteps on the floors above, the string quartet's sound now carrying more clearly through the building's structure, the muffled architecture of 100 conversations conducted simultaneously. The service corridor connecting the boot room to the main hall was, at this moment, between the interior security team's rotation cycles. A window Holloway had calculated from his original investigation notes at approximately 11 minutes, adjusted for the doubled team Priestley had deployed to 9. They had 9 minutes to reach McFred's private study, establish the recording equipment Holloway had prepared, a small device that broadcast to an encrypted receiver Darrow held outside, and position themselves before the rotation closed the window. Carol moved through the service corridor with the specific, economical motion of someone navigating a space they have inhabited rather than infiltrated. She knew which floorboards carried weight in the wrong register. She knew which door required lifting slightly on its hinges before it would open silently. She knew that the third light fitting from the service corridor's east end produced a faint hum when the estate's main circuit was under load, which it was, tonight, and that the hum functioned as an inadvertent signal for the corridor's sound dynamics. She adjusted her footfall accordingly. Holloway watched her navigate all of this and thought about Arthur Chad sorting his observations into notebooks, and understood with complete clarity that the most dangerous thing McFred had ever done, more dangerous than the massacre, more dangerous than the framing, more dangerous than the 14 months of careful narrative management, was dismissing this child as a variable too small to account for. They reached the study door at 8:31. Carol's hand found the handle. The room beyond was dark. McFred was downstairs, performing the role of host with the precision of a man who has been performing roles so long the performance has consumed the performer. Holloway entered first, moved to the desk, and positioned the recording device against the underside of the central drawer with the adhesive mount he had prepared. The device was the size of a large coin. It broadcast on a frequency that Darrow's receiver was already calibrated to. If McFred said anything in this room tonight that connected him to the massacre, any confirmation, any instruction to Priestley, any unguarded acknowledgement of the architecture they had spent a week reconstructing, it would be recorded on a device outside the estate's perimeter before the sound had finished moving through the air. Carol stood at the study window and looked down at the gala below. The terrace was lit with the soft, expensive lighting of an event designed to make its attendees feel they inhabit a better version of the world than the one outside the gate. McFred was visible on the terrace, his charcoal suit replaced tonight by black, but the posture identical, the clasped hands behind his back, the surveying quality of a man looking at something he considers an extension of himself. He had not looked up. He was not expecting anything to look up at. The northern face of his own estate, the coal chute behind his own hedging, the boot room below his own study. None of it was in his threat assessment because none of it was supposed to exist as a problem anymore. He had sent people to solve the problem. The problem was currently standing at his study window looking down at him. Two outcasts against an empire. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was wearing his own face, and he had no idea it was the last evening it would be enough. Holloway finished positioning the device, crossed to the window, stood beside Carol and looked down at the terrace. McFred had turned slightly and was speaking to a man in a dark suit, not Priestley, someone from the guest list, someone whose approval McFred was currently cultivating with the specific, focused warmth he deployed for people who were useful. Below them, the gala proceeded with the seamless, catered momentum of an event that had been planned to project invulnerability. The string quartet moved into a new piece. A server moved through the terrace crowd with a tray of something that caught the light. 100 people who did not know they were standing inside a crime scene raised their glasses and drank. Holloway looked at the recording device's small indicator light, visible only from directly above, a single green pulse every 4 seconds confirming the broadcast was live. He looked at Carol. She was still watching McFred on the terrace below with the patient, absolute attention of someone who has been waiting for the right moment since October 14th and has just identified it on the horizon. He said, very quietly, "We wait for him to come upstairs." She did not respond. She did not need to. Her hand was in her cardigan pocket, closed around the cufflink, and she was counting upward, not from fear this time, not as a coping mechanism for a terrible present, but as a rhythm, a metronome, the internal beat of someone approaching the end of a very long piece of work. The study door was behind them. The recording device was live. The evidence was documented. The gala was proceeding below with the architectural confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He hadn't checked his study. The recording device is live, and McFred is moving through his own house. McFred came upstairs at 9:47. Holloway heard him before he saw him, the specific, unhurried cadence of a man moving through his own house with the absolute proprietorial ease of someone who has never needed to consider whether a space belongs to him. One set of footsteps. No Priestley. No security. McFred had come alone, which meant he had come for a reason that required privacy, which meant the evening below had produced something that needed managing in a room where managing it could not be observed. Holloway pressed back against the wall beside the bookcase. Carol had already moved, not to hide precisely, but to position. She was standing at the far end of the study near the window alcove, in the shadow of the heavy curtain, visible if you looked, but not where you looked first when you entered a room you believed was empty. This was, Holloway had come to understand, characteristic. She did not hide anymore. She positioned. There was a distinction that Arthur had probably never articulated, but had certainly modeled. The door opened. McFred entered, crossed directly to the desk, and sat down with the motion of a man executing a familiar sequence. The chair pulled back at a specific angle, the desk lamp angled to the left, the center drawer opened, and a phone produced from inside it. A second phone, not the one he had been carrying downstairs. Holloway observed this from the bookcase and understood its significance immediately. A second phone, stored separately, used for communications that did not pass through his primary device's record. The kind of phone that exists for conversations whose content is managed by deletion rather than discretion. McFred set it on the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up. He saw Holloway first. His expression did not change, not a flinch, not the sudden physical reorganization of a man encountering the unexpected. He simply looked at Holloway with the measuring stillness of someone recalculating, and the absence of visible reaction was itself the most frightening thing in the room. Then his eyes moved to the window alcove, to Carol. And something happened in his face that was not fear and not surprise, but something older and more fundamental. The specific, involuntary quality of recognition that the body produces when it encounters something it has been trying not to think about. He looked at her for 3 seconds. She looked back at him with the absolute, patient directness she brought to everything, her hand at her side, her feet flat on the floor, her posture carrying the particular stillness of someone who has been moving toward this moment for 11 months and has arrived without urgency because urgency implies the possibility of not arriving, and she had never entertained that possibility. McFred said, "You're the butler's daughter." Not a question. His voice was conversational, controlled. The voice of a man who has decided that the way through an unexpected situation is to treat it as a scheduled one. Holloway said, "We're not here to negotiate." McFred looked at him. Holloway said, "I want you to understand the current position before you decide how to respond to it. There is a recording device in this room that is broadcasting live to a receiver outside your perimeter. Everything said from this point forward is being documented on a system you cannot access or disable from here. Your security team is managing a gala below. By the time they reach this room, the broadcast will have been running for however long this conversation lasts." He paused. "The device was placed before you came upstairs. It's already captured you entering, opening that drawer, producing that phone. That sequence alone is material." He said it plainly. Not as a threat, as information. McFred had built his entire operation on controlling information. The most destabilizing thing Holloway could do was demonstrate that the information had already left the building. McFred looked at the desk surface. He was, Holloway could see, running the calculation, the location of the device, the broadcast range, the time required to bring Priestley upstairs, the evidentiary weight of what had already been captured versus what could still be managed. He was doing it quickly, and he was doing it well, because he was not an unintelligent man. He was, in fact, a very intelligent man who had built a very sophisticated operation and had made one error of the kind that sophisticated people make specifically because of their sophistication. He had dismissed the variables that seemed too small to matter. He said, without looking up from the desk, "What do you want?" Still conversational, still controlled. The tone of a man conducting a business discussion he has not yet decided the outcome of. Carol moved, not toward him, away from the alcove, to the center of the room, which placed her equidistant between Holloway and the desk. She reached into her cardigan pocket, produced the cufflink, set it on the desk in front of McFred with the same deliberate, careful motion she used for everything breakable. The engraved initials faced upward. The dark stain along one edge caught the desk lamp's light and held it. She then reached into her other pocket and produced the evidence sleeve containing the button, the commission button, Renner and Holt, pattern 7. Set it beside the cufflink. 2 objects, 6 centimeters of desk space. The complete physical record of a night McFred had spent 14 months believing he had erased. He looked at the objects for a long time. Something moved through his expression that was not the controlled stillness of the past 2 minutes, something that arrived from below the performance level, from the place where even the most disciplined people store the things they cannot entirely manage. He looked at the cufflink, at the button, at the engraved initials, at the stain. His jaw moved once, almost imperceptibly, and then stopped. He looked up at Carol. She was looking back at him with the expression that had no name in conventional emotional vocabulary. The expression of an 8-year-old who has been carrying a dead man's evidence through 11 months of silence and temporary housing, and counting upward in the dark, and has now placed it in front of the man who made all of that necessary, and is not angry, is not triumphant, is simply present, Simply here. Simply the last person he failed to account for. He said, "Where did you find that button?" His voice had changed. Not dramatically, a register lower, the conversational control thinning at the edges. Holloway said nothing. Let the silence work. McFred looked at the button, said, "The boot room." Not a question. A man filling in the geography of his own failure. He said, "I had that room cleaned." Holloway said, "You had the tile cleaned. The baseboard gap was 3 millimeters." McFred looked at him. Something crossed his face that in a different man might have been dark amusement, the grim, involuntary recognition of a craftsman encountering the single flaw in work he considered complete. He said, 3 millimeters. He said it quietly, to no one in particular, to the room, to the desk, to the specific, irreducible mathematics of a plan that had been 99% perfect and had come apart on the remaining fraction. He leaned back in the chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then looked at Carol again with the specific quality of a man who has decided, in the space of 40 seconds, that the calculation has shifted entirely and that the only remaining variable worth managing is the narrative. He said, "You were in the pantry." Carol said nothing. He said, "Your father told you to hide." He said it without inflection, without apology, with the detached observation of someone reviewing a sequence of events in which the human beings involved are variables rather than people. He was a capable man, more capable than I had accounted for. He paused. That was my first miscalculation. I don't make many. Holloway kept his eyes on McFred and kept his breathing even and let him talk. Because McFred was talking. Not confessing. Not yet. Not in the conscious sense of a man who has decided to confess, but talking in the way that people talk when the pressure of sustained performance meets a moment of structural collapse, and the words begin moving under their own momentum, filling the space that control has just vacated. Holloway had interviewed enough people in enough pressured circumstances to know the sound of it. The words were already in the room. The recording device was already capturing them. His role now was simply to not interrupt the process. McFred said, Jang was the obvious candidate, obvious in the way that good solutions are obvious, because they fit the existing structure of belief. The city already understood what Jang was. I simply gave it the evidence to confirm what it was already prepared to conclude. He looked at the cufflink. The piece from his collection was the elegant part, forensic evidence that originates from the accused's own property, unimpeachable in isolation. He said elegant with the specific satisfaction of a man discussing a technical achievement. The suit was the practical part. The commission was under a holding company, 3 layers of separation between the tailoring house and my name. The garment was destroyed the following morning. He paused, looked at the button. Apparently not completely. He said it with a flatness that was its own kind of admission. Holloway said carefully, "The people in that room." McFred looked at him. "The massacre, they weren't," McFred said. "They were liabilities. Every one of them had accumulated information they had no legitimate need to possess. Your butler." He looked at Carol briefly, then away, had been translating between my operations and Jang's for 4 years. He knew the financial architecture of both. He had made notations. I found the notations. He said it with the same tone. The detached, inventorial tone of a man for whom other people's deaths are line items in a management review. Information held by the wrong people is a structural threat. I address the structure. Carol was completely still. She was looking at McFred with an expression that Holloway could not see from his angle but that McFred could see directly, and whatever was in it made McFred stop talking for 4 full seconds, the longest pause since he had entered the room. When he spoke again, his voice had changed again, further from the controlled register, closer to something unfiltered. He said, "Your father was the only one I regretted." He said it simply, without performance. He was genuinely exceptional. In a different arrangement of circumstances, he would have been an asset rather than a liability. He paused. "That distinction is not a comfort to you. I'm aware of that. I'm stating it as a fact." He looked at her. "You have his eyes, the same quality of attention. He looked at things the way you're looking at me now, as though he was already 2 steps ahead of the conversation." Another pause. "I should have found you sooner. That was my second miscalculation." He said it without threat, with the flat, retrospective assessment of a man conducting his own post-mortem in real time. Carol reached forward and picked up the cufflink from the desk, put it back in her cardigan pocket. left the button sleeve where it was. McFred watched her do this and said nothing. She looked at him one final time, not with hatred, not with the performed composure of someone suppressing hatred, but with something that had gone past all of that into a territory that had no conventional name, the territory that exists on the other side of 11 months of silence and counting and waiting and carrying. She turned and walked to the study door, opened it, stepped into the corridor, did not look back. McFred watched the door, then he looked at Holloway. His expression had completed its journey from controlled to something rawer and more honest than anything he had shown in the gala below. The expression of a man who has just understood, with the finality of a structural engineer reading a collapsing beam, that the building he has spent his life constructing is coming down, and that the agent of its demolition was an 8-year-old in an oversized cardigan who sorted linen in his pantry and did not forget things. He said, "She's going to be extraordinary." He said it quietly with the specific quality of admiration that has nowhere useful to go. Holloway looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "She already is." He picked up the button evidence sleeve from the desk, crossed to the door, paused with his hand on the frame, said, "The recording has everything, including the part about the notations, including the part about the structure." He paused, "including the part about the regret." He left without waiting for a response. In the corridor, Carol was waiting. Not with urgency, with the forward, decided stillness of someone who has completed one thing and is ready to begin the next. Holloway fell into step beside her. Below them, the gala continued with its catered, oblivious momentum. The string quartet was still playing. The guests were still drinking. Ronald McFred was still upstairs, sitting at his desk in the light of a lamp angled to the left, looking at the surface of a desk that now held only a button evidence sleeve and the ghost of 2 objects that had undone everything. He wasn't the hero of his own story anymore. He was just a man in a room, waiting for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Outside the estate's northern face, Darrow held the receiver with both hands and watched the broadcast indicator pulse green in the dark. Steady, uninterrupted, every syllable of the past 19 minutes captured and stored, and already moving through Sue's network toward Delia Forsythe's encrypted inbox, toward the federal crime desk, toward every channel that McFred had spent 14 months closing. The information had left the building. It was already everywhere he could not reach it. 2 outcasts against an empire. The empire didn't know it had already fallen. The recording reaches Delia Forsythe at midnight. Delia Forsythe listened to the recording twice. The first time she listened as a prosecutor, tracking the admissibility architecture, the chain of custody questions, the evidentiary weight of each statement against the legal standard required to move from recording to courtroom. The second time she listened as a person. She sat alone in her office at 12:43 in the morning, with the city quiet outside her window, and the recording playing through her laptop speakers and her hands flat on the desk in front of her. And by the time McFred's voice reached the part about addressing the structure, she had stopped taking notes entirely, and was simply sitting with the specific, leaden quality of someone who has just understood that they have been an instrument in something they would not have chosen to be an instrument in. She had prosecuted Jang Jiwoo in good faith. She had believed the evidence. She had built a case she considered sound and defended it with the full commitment of a prosecutor who takes the obligation seriously. She had been handed a construction so sophisticated it had passed every review she had applied to it. This was not her failure. She understood that. It did not make the weight of it less. She called the federal crime desk at 1:15. She called the DA's office duty attorney at 1:40. She called Judge Ola's emergency line at 2, and he answered on the second ring, which told her he had not been sleeping either, that something in his own reading of the previous days had been keeping him at the same altitude of unresolved attention that she had been operating at since the gala. She said, "I need an emergency session. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. He said, "What has changed?" She said, "Everything." He said, 7 o'clock. She called Holloway at 2:30. He answered immediately. He had not been sleeping. Had been sitting in the archive with Carol and the folder and the specific, suspended quality of people waiting for a sequence they have set in motion to complete itself. Forsythe said, "The recording is authenticated. The Button Commission record is verified. The cufflink provenance is documented." She paused. "I need the girl in that courtroom at 7. Holloway looked at Carol across the table. Carol was already looking at him. He said, "She'll be there." He covered the phone and looked at her directly, said, "It's over." She looked back at him with the expression that had no conventional name, the one that lived past triumph and past relief in the territory of something older and more permanent. Her hand went to her cardigan pocket, closed around the cufflink one final time. Then she took it out and placed it on the table between them, left it there. She did not put it back. She was done carrying it. McFred was arrested at 4:17 in the morning. Priestley had understood the geometry of it before the federal vehicles reached the estate's main gate, had understood it from the moment McFred had come back downstairs at 10:15 with an expression that had been reassembled into its social configuration, but was sitting slightly wrong, the way a picture hangs slightly wrong after the wall behind it has shifted. Priestley had looked at his employer crossing the terrace to rejoin his guests, and had run the calculation in the 4 seconds available to him, and had reached a conclusion that his professional instinct confirmed and his personal preference rejected. He had made a decision that his lawyer would later characterize as cooperation, and that Priestley himself would have characterized, if pressed, as arithmetic. By the time the federal team reached the gate, Priestley had already secured his own position through a channel that had been prepared for exactly this contingency, because men in Priestley's profession always prepare for exactly this contingency. The gate opened without resistance. The estate's interior security team stood down. McFred was located in his study, still at the desk, still in his evening suit, the desk lamp still angled to the left, and taken into custody with the procedural efficiency of an operation that had been briefed thoroughly and encountered no complications. He did not resist. He did not perform outrage. He did not invoke his attorneys in the aggressive, theatrical register of a man who believes his innocence is being violated. He stood when instructed, extended his wrists when instructed, and walked through his own front door in handcuffs with the specific, contained quality of a man who has already conducted his own verdict and found no grounds for appeal. At the threshold he paused for one moment and looked back at the estate, the marble, the art, the 17 floral arrangements still standing in the rooms beyond, with the expression of someone taking inventory of something they will not see again. Then he walked to the vehicle without looking back further. The door closed. The vehicle moved down the driveway. The estate's gate swung shut behind it with the smooth, expensive motion of hardware that had been maintained for a departure it had not anticipated. The morning was cold and clear and indifferent in the way that mornings are indifferent to the human events that occur inside them. The emergency session convened at 7 with the compressed, purposeful atmosphere of a proceeding that everyone present understood was not routine. Judge Ola entered with the particular quality of motion that replaces his normal measured pace when something requires resolution rather than management. The gallery held 6 people, Holloway in the second row, Forsyth at the prosecution table with a file that was significantly thicker than the one she had brought to the original proceedings, Ashby at the defense table with the expression of a man revising his billing projections in real time, 2 federal observers, and Vera, the guardian, who had received a call at 5 that morning that had required 3 separate explanations before she fully understood what the previous 72 hours had contained. Jang Jiwoo entered from the side corridor. He was still in the gray suit, still in the shackles. He moved to the defendant's table and sat with the same unbowed posture he had maintained throughout every appearance in this building, and his eyes went immediately to the gallery, and when they found Holloway they moved past him to the empty seat beside him, and something shifted in his expression, a question. Holloway looked toward the side door. Jang followed his eyes. Carol came in alone. No guardian flanking her, no court official directing her movement. She walked the length of the aisle with the forward, decided quality that everyone who had watched her in this building over the past days had come to recognize as entirely her own, not performed composure, not managed trauma, but the genuine, hard-won bearing of someone who has been through the worst of something and has come out the other side still facing forward. She was wearing the same gray cardigan. The sleeves were still rolled twice at the cuff. She reached the witness stand and climbed the step and sat in the chair that was too large for her, and this time she did not look at the defendant's table first. She looked at Judge Ola. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has been on the bench for 22 years and is currently in the presence of something he will not encounter again. He said, in a voice that had abandoned all procedural distance, "Good morning." She looked at him steadily. Then she looked at the defendant's table, at Jang. He was looking at her with the absolute, focused attention he had given her in this room the first time, but different now, carrying something that his controlled exterior rarely permitted through. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she raised her left hand, 3 fingers folded, thumb flat. A small downward wave, slow, deliberate, the full version, the one her father had pressed into her palm in the dark. But she did not perform it as warning this time. She performed it as what it had always been before that night: greeting, recognition, the private language of people who know each other's code. Jang looked at her hand. Then he dipped his chin, the same single motion he had given her across the courtroom in those first seconds, but carrying now a weight it had not had then. It was not operational acknowledgement. It was something the criminal vocabulary did not have a precise term for, but that the human vocabulary does. Gratitude, without conditions, from someone who does not offer it easily. Judge Ola said, "Miss Chad, I understand you have a statement you wish to make directly to this court." He said it without procedural scaffolding. No, you are reminded. No, you are required. Simply an open door. Carol looked at him. Then she looked at the room, at Holloway, at Forsyth, at Ashby with his revised projections, at the federal observers with their pens. At the empty gallery that would have been full for the original proceedings and was intimate now in its smallness, which made what was about to happen feel less like testimony and more like the thing testimony is supposed to be. Truth delivered by the person who holds it, to the people who need to hear it. She opened her mouth. The room did not breathe. Said, "My father's name was Arthur Chad." Her voice was the voice of someone who has not used it publicly in 11 months, slightly uncertain in register, slightly effortful at the edges, but underneath that, clear, precise. The voice of a child who has always known exactly what she wanted to say and has been waiting for the room that was worth saying it in. She said, "He was the best person I knew. He taught me to notice things. He taught me to hold information carefully until the right moment." She paused. "He knew the right moment was coming. That's why he showed me the signal. That's why he showed me the coal chute. That's why he made sure I knew the code for the service gate and the key for the boot room door." She looked at the desk surface for a moment, then back at Ola. "He was preparing me, not for hiding, for this." She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not stop once. She did not lose the thread once. She described the Tuesday in October with the specific, sensory precision of a witness who has been storing the account in the most protected part of her memory for 11 months, keeping it intact, keeping it accurate, keeping it for exactly this purpose. She described the smell that came under the pantry door. She described her father's hands and the tremor in them that his face refused to show. She described the silhouette in the doorway, the height, the posture, the 2 cold points of reflected light at the wrists. She described the boot room floor and the cufflink and the button and the counting. She described all of it in the clear, unembellished language of a child who has not yet learned to perform emotion for an audience and whose account therefore carries the specific, irrefutable quality of something that has not been shaped by anyone's expectations. Forsyth did not interrupt. Ashby did not interrupt. Nobody interrupted. The federal observers wrote continuously. Judge Ola sat completely still and listened with the quality of attention he reserved for the moments in 22 years that he would carry with him permanently. Now, what Carol demonstrated in that courtroom is something that the legal system has been slowly, imperfectly learning to recognize, that children are not inherently unreliable witnesses. The research on this is substantial and clear. Studies in forensic developmental psychology consistently show that children's eyewitness accounts, when gathered without leading questions and allowed to emerge in the child's own language and sequence, are frequently more accurate than adult accounts of comparable events. Reason is architectural. Children have not yet developed the adult habit of narrative retrospection, the unconscious smoothing and reshaping of memory into a coherent story. They report what they retained in the form they retained it. The legal system's historical skepticism toward child witnesses has not been supported by the evidence and has, in numerous documented cases, allowed perpetrators to escape accountability specifically because the most credible witness in the room was the smallest one. Carol Chad's 11 months of silence was not unreliability. It was preservation. She had been waiting for the room where her account would be received as what it was, not managed, not filtered, not rooted through the interpretive machinery of adults with institutional interests. Just heard. When she finished, the room remained quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Judge Ola said, "Thank you, Miss Chad." He said it with a simplicity that carried everything it needed to carry. He turned to Forsyth. She was already on her feet. She said, "The prosecution moves to dismiss all charges against the defendant Jang Jiwoo with prejudice on the basis of exculpatory evidence establishing that the forensic foundation of the original case was deliberately fabricated." Ashby said, "The defense concurs and endorses the motion." Ola said, "Motion granted." He looked at the shackles on Jang's wrists, said to the marshal, "Remove those." The marshal moved. The shackles came off. Jang sat at the defendant's table for a moment with his wrists free and his hands resting on the surface in front of him, looking at the space where the metal had been. He looked at Carol. She was looking back at him from the witness stand. He said, in a voice low enough that only the people nearest him could hear it, "Arthur would be proud of you." She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said, "I know." She said it without performance, without the theatrical solemnity the moment might have invited. She said it the way her father had taught her to say everything worth saying. Simply, accurately, with the full weight of someone who means exactly what they are saying and nothing beyond it. Justice isn't given. It's taken by the people willing to carry the truth long enough to deliver it to the room where it changes everything. There is a final thing worth understanding about what happened in that courtroom. It was not the recording alone that ended Ronald McFred. It was not the cufflink alone, or the button, or Holloway's folder, or Jang's network, or Forsyth's motion. It was the convergence, the specific, unlikely assembly of people that McFred's own actions had created. He had orphaned a child and she had found a journalist. He had framed an innocent man and that man had protected her. He had tried to silence a witness, and the witness had spent 11 months becoming someone who could not be silenced. He had built his operation on the assumption that power protects itself and that the powerless stay protected against. He had been wrong about that in the most complete and final way available to a person who is wrong. McFred was formally charged at 9 that morning with 6 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of criminal conspiracy, and 2 counts of evidence tampering. The DA's office issued a statement at noon. By that evening, the building in the northern quarter with his family name in 4-foot bronze letters had a different quality to it. Still standing, still visible, but carrying now the specific weight of something that has been revealed rather than displayed. Carol left the courthouse at 10:15 with Vera, who had revised her caseload management significantly in the preceding 6 hours, and was now walking beside her ward with the full, undivided attention of someone who understands, belatedly, the precise dimensions of what she has been responsible for. Holloway walked on the other side. He did not speak. Carol did not speak. The morning was still cold, still clear, still indifferent in the way mornings are. She walked between them with her hands out of her pockets, both of them, empty, open, at her sides and her face forward, and her pace carrying the specific quality of motion that belongs to someone who has set something down that they have been carrying for a very long time and is now simply walking, without the weight, in the direction of whatever comes next. She was 8 years old. She had been right about something terrible for 11 months. She had delivered the truth to the room where it mattered, and she had done it in her own words, in her own time, in the voice that had been waiting inside the silence for exactly this. Arthur Chad had taught her to notice things. She had noticed everything. She had held it carefully. She had waited for the right moment. The right moment was over. The next one was beginning. And for the first time since October 14th, she was not counting upward. She did not need to. She had arrived.